this video, I'm going to continue the series that I've been doing with Settler Colonialism in space. As you know, I really enjoyed doing this series because I definitely think that Settler Colonialism is an argument that has a lot of rich critiques, I think, to make out of its literature base in terms of being able to critique the public-private divide that the kind of resolution is really made to I think study and think about really heavily in terms of its relationship to space. And I also think that it has really good arguments to kind of make in terms of why humans have a desire to go to space in the first place, and the way in which that creates a particular paradigm of the continuance of settler colonialism. And in this video, I kind of want to continue exploring that as we continue to talk about how policy teams can better respond to settler colonialism. In the last video, if you didn't watch it, I definitely would. I talked about things like what your priorities should be, the framing arguments, and the thesis arguments that you should be using in order to make your argument start to make a lot more sense in terms of what objectives you want to achieve and how you can kind of make those very clear to the judge from the top portion level of the debate. And in this video, I want to continue to kind of talk about this in the context of links, permutation, impact comparison, and alternative. If you haven't, I would definitely watch the first video, which is the intro to settler colonialism in space, which does a lot in terms of just giving the main ideas about where I think these critiques are going and what I think is most pertinent for the affirmative and the negative. And so hopefully, if you're trying to kind of figure out where we are in the series, or what this kind of critique will look like on the negative or the affirmative, that's a good place to kind of get a good background idea for what we're kind of discussing here. And that kind of allows you to kind of come into the conversation with a lot of full knowledge, I think, for the places that this video will really go as we begin to talk about the link, perm, impact comparison, and alternative. As we start off just talking about the link debate, I think that a lot of the link arguments that I kind of have talked about the most fit in those kind of two frames: the critique of the public-private divide, and the kind of just innate desire to go out to space as part of a settler colonial project of erasing genocide on Earth and being able to create and cleanse a new history to claim in a sense on for settlers, and to claim as free territory that's up for anyone's grabs. And I think that there are a couple places in which policy teams can generally answer this. The first is I think that you can take a lot of the tips that I've kind of talked about from the first video for this first link argument to kind of talk about why, even if they're right about why the public and the private don't have a particular long amount of gap between them, there is a difference in the way in which particularly space operationalizes the public and private sphere. I think making the argument that there's a big difference between Elon Musk and space privatization and the idea of the global commons and the way that it can be taken up for the public, and how, for instance, those kind of apparatuses of privatization have no bound to serve humanity, can be used and only for the production of capitalization, the creation of new places for people to go on vacation and stuff like that, and why those kind of usages of space only speed us further towards forms of human death and basically existential crisis through things whatever the kind of impact advantage that you're reading, whether that be about the international side of it, or about the the possibility of space debris, things like climate change and stuff like that. And so I think trying to overwhelm and just disprove all of the significant harms that change between the public and private, even if you don't win that the public is necessarily completely safe, I think it definitely is not super hard to win that the private is net worse than the public in a lot of ways that uniquely hurt people that can't be just kind of drafted under they're just conceptually the same thing. And I think that the more that you're able to bring out those nuanced examples and responses of what those harms are, the easier it'll be for you to kind of assert yourself in the debate. I then think against some of the other arguments about just kind of the innate desire to go out to space. This requires that kind of first portion of what we were talking about in the framing and thesis portions of the debate and the priorities from the last video, where it's really important, I think, for you to be able to win out that the space kind of race is an inevitable facet of human life now. There's no way that humans won't go out to space, and so it's just a question of how we use it. Even if they're right about it being a settler colonial desire, that only raises the question of how we're able to make a more equitable usage of those things now, not to just throw everything away and leave the law open so that other folks can take up and use space in ways that are more harmful than what the AF could do. And I think that making arguments about why the affirmative then becomes the best of some of the worst worlds that could exist in relationship to space, and why refusal of space is impossible, can definitely set you up for some good alternative indicts later, and good link turn arguments that could make the permutation a lot easier, which is kind of where I want to go now. I think that on the permutation, a lot of these kind of top level arguments are ways that you put pressure on the alternative to be able to resolve some of the facets of what you're talking about in the context of space, or it kind of ends up falling to the permutation. I think that's really important to continue to pressure that type of same idea in these types of debates, because I think that being able to win that the alternative doesn't have a resolution for privatized space entities, or ways to stop these people from being able to access space and turn it outside the global commons, can be really a good way to overwhelm the other team with lax and net benefits to the alternative that uniquely separate them from the permutation, and thus they kind of become more net benefits of ways in which their activism begin to check and become better usages of the public to make space operations more accessible to the public, or more equally distributed among the public. And I think that those things are incredibly important to kind of consider in terms of how it kind of like opens up room for you to be able to kind of negotiate like what the public is and what types of like actions can it take, how revolutionary can the public be, and make arguments about why it's a useful tool for being able to demand change in the context of like settler colonial genocide and stuff like that. Could all be useful explanations of like why that permutation is particularly necessary. I then think that when you go to like the impact comparison alternative portion of the debate, the impact comparison portion of the debate I think is really like important, because it's one of the places where I said in like the last videos, a couple of videos where I was talking about like how to read this as a negative strategy, that negative teams could really pick up additional link arguments by like going head on about this debate about vitality. And I don't think that with a lot of the affirmatives that will be read in the context of LD, that necessary link is really avoidable. And so I really think it's a question of how you really take up this debate and take it on its head. I feel like a lot of the arguments need to be about why, like for instance, even if they're right about like the way in which we shouldn't be able to like risk that, the way that we shouldn't over prioritize human vitality, it doesn't really answer the question of like the inevitability of space that you're raising, because like people that are able to like have the material means to escape the kind of like existential dangers that are raised in the context of the earth will survive. And so it only is kind of a question of like who we decide to risk. And I think that the more you're able to make your impacts make sense in the context of like how particular impacts in space like really uniquely impact those that have like the least amount of infrastructure or defense from like various types of existential crises, and why that kind of produces the same type of violence and the ability for settler kind of desires to be able to be fulfilled by their ability to kind of like leave Earth in the kind of like in the kind of like apocalypse that it is, in order to create a different kind of like world in which the kind of like white desires towards space are really fully realized, and that only the affirmative kind of gives the possibility of like refusing that possible timeline. And I think that making arguments about that can add on to this pressure that you'll be doing with the alternative, which is the place that I kind of want to finish off. I feel like when a lot of alternatives in this case are really going to be based on like refusal, or just the idea that there shouldn't be a set answer to the question of like should we go out to space or not, in context of things like incommensurability or stuff like that, a lot of the arguments that you want to make to pressure the alternative are about like why the space privatization is coming now, coming fast, and is being developed like as we speak. And so having rapid responses that are like technical and legal to these kind of questions is like really important because of how pressing in front of us these concerns are. And I think that making arguments that really cite the developments of SpaceX and other privatized spheres can be really helpful in terms of like making sense of why the alternative like needs to have some type of like answer to the question. Otherwise it like really only results in a question of like the permutation, which is like just that even if we should have an answer of that affirms civil society in the state all the time, the particular instance that the app is using of it is good and is a possible answer to the question of like privatized space. And being able to win that's kind of like worse than the impacts that the negative is citing, I think could be making the debate a lot easier for you and advantageous when you're trying to figure out what portion of this criticism you should really be focusing in on. So hopefully this video is helpful for you, and hopefully you'll tune into more stuff that I'll be doing with space colonization and settler colonialism and space colonization and space privatization. And yeah, thank you so much for tuning in.